When I was in the 5th grade, my parents gave me a great gift. They took me out of school for a few days and on a trip to Washington, D.C. Everything about that trip was awesome. My first airplane ride, going to see the Washington Senators play on a really chilly April night. Even something they didn't plan on, I thought, in the words I used back then, was really, really cool. You see, we were there in 1971 over the time when the May Day protests against the Vietnam War were taking place. Out the window of our hotel room, I could look, we were high enough up, and see on the roof of the Treasury Department building right across the street, soldiers holding rifles. The protesters, who were right down the street, camped out around the Washington Monument, were hoping to shut down the government. And so, to avert this, soldiers armed with weapons and tear gas shepherded them, moved them through the streets of D.C., eventually arresting 12,000 people, the largest mass arrest in our country's history. Today's Palm Sunday, the day when we remember that story of Jesus and his friends and followers entering Jerusalem for the festival of Passover, and the start of what in the Christian calendar is called Holy Week. When I try to imagine that procession into Jerusalem, what I see is a dusty Mediterranean version of what I saw in Washington in 1971. A ragtag group of outsiders coming to the seat of power, where the authorities are trying to maintain control. Jesus must have known that things weren't likely to go well, and he went anyway. How come, I wonder? Why didn't he just stay out in the country, in Galilee, where the people liked him and where he had a successful ministry? Almost 2,000 years later, Martin Luther King Jr. and his new wife, Coretta, were living in Boston. Martin finishing up his doctorate at BU, and Coretta her music studies at the New England Conservatory. They liked the freedom of living in the North, but they decided, after much discussion, to go back to the segregated South, King writes, because they felt something of a moral obligation to return, at least for a few years. There was work to be done. And they never left. 14 years later, in 1968, Martin Luther King went to Memphis to support striking sanitation workers. And that's where he was killed. On the night before he died, he said these words: "Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up the mountain, and I've looked over, and I have seen the promised land. And I may not get there with you," he said, "but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." Why would you go to a place where you know it's dangerous, where you might even be killed? Why did Jesus go to Jerusalem and Martin Luther King to Memphis? Why do soldiers go off to war and police and firefighters go to work? I imagine they would answer in one way or another, because I have to. It's my job, or it's my calling, or they need me. Let me tell you a story. It's about a single mother who has 2 teenagers, an older boy and a younger girl. One day, The younger child, who's always been headstrong and independent, comes to her mother and says, I'm ready to go out and make my way in the world. Whatever is coming to me, my inheritance, I want it now. Well, of course, the mother doesn't want her daughter to leave. It breaks her heart to even think of it, but she knows she can't make her stay. So she comes up with the money. And as soon as she has it, the daughter packs a few things and she's off, anxious to get away and see what awaits over the horizon. She finds new friends there. She falls in with a fast crowd, and she spends her money recklessly. She has a great time. And before long, she's gone through her whole inheritance. But she figures she can get a job and make enough money to continue with her free and easy lifestyle. But then, at that moment, the economy tanks. And plenty of people are also looking for work. She's forced into work that's dirty and tiring and demeaning. But what else can she do? One day, after a period of time passes, it could be months, it could be years of this. She is hungry and tired and at the end of her rope, and is tempted to sink even lower in order to make some money, in order to survive. But then she comes to her senses. She thinks to herself, even the people who work for my mom, who clean the toilets and scrub the floors, even they have a better life than I do. I'll go back to my mother, and I'll apologize for being so foolish, and I'll ask her to let me work in her house. All the way home, she rehearses her apology. Mommy, I have dishonored you and am no longer worthy to be called your daughter. But will you let me work in your house so that I can come home? When she is still a ways off, her mother, who is standing by a window looking out, perhaps her mother does this every day, wondering about that daughter who is gone. Her mother, when she's still a long way off, sees her coming. The mother's heart is filled with compassion, and she runs to her daughter, takes her in her arms, covers her with kisses. The daughter begins her speech. I am no longer worthy to be called your daughter. But the mother hears none of it. She says, you're home. You're alive. Come into the house. Let's get some clean clothes on you. I'm calling our family and friends. We've got to celebrate. Now, a little while later, the other child, the son, the elder one, all this time he's been out working in the fields as he does every day, except for the Sabbath. He hears music and he smells food cooking, and he asks another worker, what's going on? And this worker tells him, your sister has come home, and your mother is throwing a party for her. This makes the brother really mad. So when his mother comes looking for him, he says, all these years I have worked so hard for you and never given you a moment of trouble. And what have you done for me? This daughter of yours comes back after spending your money and breaking your heart, and you throw a party? And he says that word that children through the ages have perfected. It's not fair. But the mother loves him at least as much as she loves her daughter, and she puts her arm around him and says, you know that I love you, and everything that I have is yours. But we have to celebrate, because this sister of yours, she was dead, and now she's alive. She was lost, and now she's found. I wonder if any of you recognize this story. I've taken a few liberties with it, disguised it a little bit by changing the gender of a couple of the characters. My teenage daughter didn't understand why I was doing that. She glanced at this. It was sitting on a table yesterday, and but she's the practical one in the family. It's a story that Jesus told. I was just trying to be more inclusive. Spread. It's a story that Jesus told, traditionally called the parable of the prodigal son. It's one of a series of stories he told to teach about the nature of God. Back then, people often thought of God as a judge and a disciplinarian. Some of us grew up with those images too. But that wasn't how Jesus experienced God. He told this story and others like it to teach people that God wasn't anything like they imagined. The God Jesus knew was like a loving parent, like that mom. Not an angry judge, but one who longs to be in relationship, who's always calling us to come to our senses and to come home. Do you know what that word prodigal means? Growing up, hearing the story, I always thought it must have meant bad or misbehaving or outcast or something like that. Prodigal means spendthrift or extravagant to a degree bordering on recklessness. It has the same root as that word profligate. It's been said that the real prodigal in this story is not the child, but the parent, the one who gives love freely, recklessly, whether it is deserved or not. Jesus said that's what God is like, always ready to welcome us home and throw a party when we arrive. If we have trouble believing this, it's because we ourselves have not known enough unconditional love. We live in a world that keeps score of right and wrong, that's always counting the cost, that's always telling us in a million different ways where we stand in the pecking order. But Jesus imagined a different country where different rules apply, where you can always go home and be welcomed with open arms, no matter how long you've been gone, no matter what you've done, no matter who you've disappointed or failed or hurt. This is the core of our Universalist faith, that the nature of God is love. This doesn't mean that we don't need to take responsibility for our actions. Doesn't mean we don't need to seek forgiveness and make amends for our mistakes. Of course we do. But we don't need to dwell on the past or be imprisoned by it. Rather, we are called to give ourselves to this great love. More than most of us, Jesus was able to be a conduit for God's love. He was what the Bible scholar Marcus Borg calls a spirit person, one to whom the sacred is an experiential reality. That's where his power came from, and it came from his deep connection to the divine. It's what made him so attractive to some people and so threatening to others. But he wasn't the only one. Jesus didn't go to Jerusalem because his death was part of God's plan. He went there to celebrate Passover, the story of how God liberated his people. I don't believe it's ever part of God's plan for there to be suffering or human sacrifice. Jesus went to Jerusalem because he couldn't not go. Knowing that he was loved, his ministry was about standing with those at the margins and loving them, about speaking truth to power, no matter what the cost. That's why he went. Didn't Martin Luther King inhabit a similar reality? When the society said, "You are a second-class citizen because of the color of your skin," he knew that was not true, because God had said, "I have made you in my image, and you are precious in my sight." That's why he went to Memphis. Doing God's will meant standing with those in need, standing on the side of love and justice. when you know that you are loved, when you really know this, then you are capable of some extraordinary things. You can be good to yourself. You can reach out in love and concern for others. You can stand up for those who are not able to speak for themselves. You can even sometimes put your life on the line. Martin went to Memphis. Jesus went to Jerusalem, not because it was part of some grand plan, but because they each knew where they needed to be and who they needed to be with. They were willing, if necessary, to pay that cost. If I had only one sermon to preach, it would be this: God loves you. So please start acting like it. Please trust that even if you can't sense it right now, there is a presence in the world that's on the side of love and justice, a presence that is rooting for you. This church exists to proclaim that love, and not only that, to help you put that love into action, to offer a place where you can feel its presence, where you can get an infusion of that love so you can take it with you wherever you go. That's why we're here, to be a beacon of hope for those who are lost and trying to find their way home, to be a community where we are strengthened and encouraged, to be the people we were born to be. A line from my favorite hymn says, "We are builders of that city." Let's get on with it and do our part to help heal and bless our world. Amen.